Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Gilbert, Arizona. January 14th, 2009. A neighborhood still asleep, sprinklers clicking on in front yards, houses with lights off and doors locked. Just another Wednesday in the suburbs until one phone call cracked the silence. At exactly 2:45 in the morning, a woman's voice hit the Gilbert Police Department dispatch line, shaky, urgent. She said her husband had been attacked in their bedroom. She was crying, gasping, said there was blood everywhere. The dispatcher asked, "Is the suspect still there?" She said no. "Did you see who it was?" She hesitated. Within minutes, paramedics and patrol units rolled onto a cul-de-sac off Elliott and Wrecker Road. A modest two-story home, no broken glass, no kicked-in door, no neighbors reported hearing anything, no dogs barking, no yelling. The front porch light was on. Inside the master bedroom, 34-year-old Dale Harrell was found unconscious, lying on his back. Blood pooled beneath his head. Blunt force trauma. Several wounds to the skull. No sign he ever left the bed. His wife, 31-year-old Marissa-Suzanne DeVault, was standing barefoot in the hallway. She had no visible injuries except a red patch on her chest she said came from being pushed. A third person, Stanley Cook Jr., a man in his early 40s who also lived in the house, was pacing outside on the driveway, incoherent and muttering something about trying to protect Marissa. At first glance, there was chaos. But as first responders moved through the scene, the details felt too controlled, too quiet. Something didn't fit. The bedroom showed no signs of struggle. A lamp on the nightstand was still upright, pillows undisturbed, no overturned furniture, no shards of glass, no obvious signs of forced entry. The back door was locked, so was the front. The only real violence was on Dale's body and on the pillow under his head. Marissa told officers Dale had been attacked by someone. She couldn't give a name. She implied it could have been Stanley, but wouldn't say it directly. "He came in. I think he hit Dale, but I don't know. I was scared. I thought Dale was hurting me," she said. That contradiction, blaming Dale while also calling him the victim, was noted immediately in the officer's log. Stanley Cook was taken in for a psych evaluation. His behavior wasn't just strange, it was disoriented, slurred speech, fragmented memory. Police couldn't rely on him for a timeline, at least not yet. Dale, meanwhile, was loaded into an ambulance and rushed to a trauma unit. He had a pulse, but shallow. Paramedics noted repeated shallow breathing and a Glasgow coma score of 4, deep unconsciousness. His condition was critical. Back at the house, forensic investigators began processing the scene. A standard grid sweep. UV for blood trace. Photography for spatter patterns. Latent prints. Shoe impressions on the carpet. The works. Here's where things started to tilt. There was no forced entry, no foreign fingerprints, no evidence of a break-in, no tool marks on doors, no disturbed soil beneath windows. Just one man unconscious in bed, and a woman with no concrete explanation. Crime scene techs found the likely weapon, a hammer, not at the bedside, not in the kitchen, not dropped in a panic, but buried beneath a load of laundry in a basket down the hall. Blood-stained, one side coated with hair and tissue. That didn't match a chaotic attack from a stranger. It suggested something else. Still, it was early. Officers kept everything logged, sealed, and by the book. In the body cam footage recorded that night, one officer is heard saying quietly to another, "She's not acting right. She's not upset the way you'd expect." Over the next few hours, Marissa was taken to the Gilbert police station for a voluntary interview. She wasn't placed under arrest, not yet, but questions were stacking up. Dale Harrell was still alive, barely, and his wife? She was telling her third version of the same story. When a violent crime unfolds inside a home with no witnesses and no surveillance footage, the only place left to start is the victim, who they were, what they were like. What pressures surrounded them in the final weeks of their life. In cases like this, the answer to what happened often begins with understanding to whom it happened. Dale Harrell, 34 years old at the time of the assault, was pronounced dead on February 9, 2009, 26 days after being found unconscious in his own bed. The death certificate lists blunt force trauma to the head as the cause, with complications from cerebral edema and prolonged comatose state noted as contributing factors. He never woke up, never spoke, never gave a statement. What we do know is what was left behind in the aftermath. Dale worked in IT support for a local company in the East Valley area. His coworkers later told investigators he was private, non-confrontational, and the type to fix a problem quietly. He had 3 daughters, 2 from his marriage to Marissa-Suzanne DeVault and 1 from a previous relationship. He had no criminal record, no known history of violence, and no pending legal disputes. He was, by all appearances, a father trying to keep a fractured household afloat. According to cell phone records, Dale's last outbound call was made on January 13th, the night before the assault, to his employer's voicemail. He left a message explaining he wouldn't be at work the next day due to a migraine. That message became a key timestamp for the medical examiner later, as it placed Dale lucid and active approximately 6 hours before the incident. When investigators requested Dale's primary care records, nothing indicated a pattern of injury, substance abuse, or psychiatric distress. He had a few standard visits for back pain and 1 allergy-related prescription. No emergency visits, no broken bones, no signs of physical altercations at any time during his marriage. If there had been domestic conflict, it hadn't made its way into the medical system. What's more telling is what investigators didn't find. No restraining orders, no CPS reports, no police calls from the household before January 14th. Not even a noise complaint. But just because nothing was on paper doesn't mean the home was stable. That's something investigators understand well. They reached out to Dale's close contacts, his brother, a longtime friend, and his mother. All 3 painted a picture of a man increasingly isolated in the last year of his life. He worked longer hours, returned calls less frequently, seemed fatigued. His brother shared a voicemail Dale left 3 weeks prior. "I'll call you back next week. Just trying to keep the peace at home right now." In forensic profiling, those words matter. Trying to keep the peace implies conflict, but also a reluctance to escalate. Investigators flagged it as circumstantial context. But emotional patterns aren't evidence. Medical discovery came next. The trauma team at Banner Desert Medical Center documented multiple contusions to Dale's skull, centered around the right parietal region. CT scans revealed fractures to the cranial vault and significant intracranial swelling. No defensive wounds were found on his forearms or hands, no bruising to the chest or shoulders, nothing to suggest he had been upright when the blows occurred. The trajectory analysis, done using 3D skull modeling, showed a downward arc of impact, consistent with the victim lying flat on his back. Blood had pooled behind the head and neck, meaning Dale remained in that position post-injury. He was not moved. One of the ER nurses noted in her report, his pupils were blown, no response to light, BP unstable, GCS of 4. A Glasgow coma score of 4 is near vegetative. That's the number investigators use not to build narrative, but to establish urgency. From that moment forward, the case was no longer about if Dale might die. It was when. At that point, Gilbert PD notified their homicide division, not because a suspect had been identified, but because the injuries were deemed incompatible with accidental trauma. The term used in the incident log, assault with lethal prognosis. So why does this matter in the broader context? Because investigators needed to answer a simple question. Was this a defensive action gone too far or a targeted act of violence? For that, they'd need to look beyond Dale's health records. They examined digital data, Dale's laptop, his work emails, and his phone logs. Nothing inflammatory, nothing erratic. But there was one curious deletion. His call log for the day before the attack had been manually cleared from his device. Only the message left for work remained, stored by the employer's system. The phone itself had not been broken or stolen. It was found on the nightstand, unplugged, at 89% battery. Forensics couldn't recover the missing logs, but the action raised questions. Why delete a call log? Why that day? Marissa never mentioned touching Dale's phone. She said he wasn't texting much lately, but the forensics said otherwise. His phone showed signs of activity in the early evening. Texts sent, apps opened. Then nothing past 9:23 p.m. That digital dead zone from 9:30 p.m. to 2:45 a.m. became critical. The timeline was tightening. Investigators weren't ready to assign guilt, not yet, but the narrative that this was a spontaneous act of protection it was losing ground. Back at the hospital, Dale's condition continued to deteriorate. By January 20th, he was declared brain dead. Arizona law requires 2 separate tests, conducted at least 6 hours apart, to confirm that diagnosis. Both confirmed it. But the family chose to keep him on life support for 2 more weeks, hoping for what doctors knew was statistically impossible. On February 9th, Dale Harrell was officially pronounced dead. That same day, the Maricopa County Medical Examiner upgraded the case from suspicious assault to active homicide investigation. The question wasn't just who did it, it was how long they'd been planning it. In homicide investigations, one constant remains: timelines matter. The minute statements begin to shift, it's no longer about what's said. It's about what doesn't match. Marissa-Suzanne DeVault gave her first formal interview to Gilbert PD within hours of the 2:45 a.m. 911 call on January 14, 2009. She was not under arrest, nor considered a suspect. The goal was clarity. Who entered the home? What led to the injuries? Why was Dale Harrell found unconscious with blunt force trauma to the skull? Her answer? She didn't know. Marissa claimed she had been asleep, awoken by movement or sounds, and found Dale already hurt. Then she mentioned Stanley Cook Jr., the third person living in the home, possibly being in the room. Then she corrected herself. He wasn't in the room, or maybe he was. She couldn't recall exactly. The interview transcript showed inconsistencies within minutes. When asked how she discovered the injuries, Marissa initially said she was in the bed next to Dale. Later, she stated she had gone to sleep on the couch that night because of a disagreement. In psychological evaluations, this is often called narrative drift. But in forensic analysis, it's something else, a red flag. Investigators returned to the home to reconcile the statements with physical evidence. The forensic report from the scene already established 3 crucial elements: no sign of forced entry, blood spatter localized to the bed area, the weapon, a hammer, was located in a laundry basket down the hall, partially concealed beneath clothing. Marissa's new version of events now claimed that Stanley had attacked Dale in an attempt to protect her from ongoing abuse. She described Dale as aggressive, controlling, and prone to physical intimidation. But when asked for prior incidents or police reports, she had none. Detectives pressed for specifics, dates, injuries. Any calls she might have made, she answered, "I kept quiet to keep the family together." The detective noted in his summary, "No medical history, no prior reports, no corroborating witness, statements lack time-stamped support." At that point, Marissa was still free to leave. She wasn't under suspicion, yet. But her willingness to reframe her version of events, even subtly, gave detectives a starting point. Meanwhile, Stanley Cook was questioned in a separate room. His mental state made the process difficult. He was on medication, showed signs of confusion, and could not account for specific timelines. At one point, he mentioned hearing Dale and Marissa arguing, but then stated he thought everything was fine. Asked directly if he struck Dale, Stanley said, "I don't remember. Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't." Cognitive evaluations later determined he was not competent to provide a linear recollection of events. Blood tests showed no alcohol, but there were sedatives in his system, prescribed. Ultimately, police determined that Stanley Cook's mental and physical state at the time of the incident made him an unreliable source of truth. He was released and placed under non-criminal psychiatric supervision. The investigative team turned back to the house, this time focusing on the timeline inside the house. Phone logs, ambient temperature readings, HVAC activity, and time-stamped digital artifacts were cross-referenced. Dale's work laptop had not been used since 8:56 p.m. on January 13th. The home's wireless router showed 0 traffic from Dale's device between then and 2 o'clock a.m. Marissa's device, however, showed activity at 11:12 p.m. and again at 12:49 a.m., including a browser search that raised eyebrows. Head, trauma, sleep symptoms. No context was given. The search was deleted, but later recovered from browser cache by forensic techs. The timestamp placed it roughly 2 hours before the 911 call. The question formed quickly. If someone truly panicked, why would they look up a medical search before calling for help? One investigator noted in his report, medical response was delayed until after an internet search on injury-related symptoms. Intent remains unclear, but chronology suggests prior knowledge of injury. At this point, Marissa was brought in for a second voluntary interview. Her demeanor had changed. No longer visibly distressed, she appeared composed, at times evasive. She now added a new detail. She believed Dale had acted strangely that night and that perhaps he injured himself. That version contradicted her earlier account of an intruder, then of Stanley, then of vague confusion. The shift was not subtle, it was systemic. Detectives paused the interview. It was clear that no version of Marissa's story matched the forensic evidence. Her statement moved each time the investigation advanced. When a suspect does that, detectives don't chase the narrative. They chase the timeline. And the timeline was getting tighter. The blood on the hammer was dry when recovered. Luminol detected no attempt to clean the weapon, but its location beneath clothes indicated intentional concealment, not abandonment in panic. The scene itself remained sterile beyond the bed. No blood on the floor, no trail, no struggle. This wasn't an explosion of rage. It was deliberate, controlled. Forensic psychologists call it narrative management. When a person adjusts facts post-event to shape perception, the discrepancies accumulate. And eventually, the story can't hold. Back at the station, the investigative team began constructing a digital timeline overlay. Phone data, router pings, statements, hammer location, blood pattern geometry. Everything led to one conclusion. The injuries occurred between 11:30 p.m. and 12:30 a.m. The 911 call wasn't placed until 2:45 a.m. That 2-hour gap became the focal point. No matter how many stories surfaced, none could erase that silence. When investigators hit a wall with changing stories, they followed the paper trail. Money leaves a record. And in violent crimes within families, financial stress is often the shadow behind the violence. Detectives from the Gilbert Police Department began digging into the couple's financial records within a week of Dale's death. It wasn't just about finding unpaid bills or credit card statements, it was about identifying pressure points. What they found didn't paint a picture of stability. Bank records showed multiple high-value transactions moving between Marissa DeVault's personal accounts and a man named Alan Flores, someone who is neither a relative nor a known business associate. Over a 12-month period, transfers totaling nearly $300,000 were made or linked to debts tied to Marissa. This discovery triggered the involvement of financial crime specialists who were called to coordinate with the homicide unit. Flores quickly became a person of interest. Investigators discovered he wasn't just a lender, he had a personal relationship with Marissa, something she hadn't disclosed in any interview. Detectives cross-checked phone logs and email metadata and found hundreds of contacts between Marissa and Flores in the months leading up to Dale's injury, including text messages exchanged late at night while Dale was still alive. One particular email retrieved from Flores's laptop carried a line that drew immediate attention. "Once this is over, you'll have the means to clear everything." Although vague, the timing and tone of this email were hard to dismiss. Combined with Marissa's financial ties, it suggested a potential motive that extended beyond fear or self-defense. Investigators needed to determine what this referred to. Insurance policies were the next logical step. Dale Harrell had a life insurance policy worth approximately $1.25 million, with Marissa listed as the primary beneficiary. Records showed that the policy was reviewed and updated within the past 2 years. Forensic accountants noted that no significant life events, like purchasing a new home, would explain why Marissa had been so financially overextended while having access to potential future payouts. To verify the legitimacy of the debt with Flores, investigators subpoenaed his financial statements. What they found raised even more questions. Flores had wired large sums to Marissa's account under the description of personal loan, but there were no repayment plans or interest schedules. In one recorded interview, Flores admitted to detectives, "She promised to pay me back after she got the insurance. She said Dale had a good policy." That statement was carefully documented and cross-checked with the timeline of events. If true, it could show premeditation tied to financial gain, but investigators needed more than money as a motive. They needed evidence connecting the financial stress to the night of the attack. Digital forensics played a role again. A forensic review of Marissa's devices showed browser searches on financial hardship, loan default consequences, and life insurance policies. These searches were conducted days before the attack and were not part of any prior narrative she offered to police. Detectives also examined Marissa's phone activity on the night of the assault. At 11:12 p.m., less than 3 hours before the 911 call, her phone pinged off a local cell tower during a call to Flores. While the content of the call could not be retrieved, the timing was critical. It placed her in direct communication with someone who had a financial stake in her decisions. During a follow-up interview, Marissa was confronted with the financial records. She appeared unsettled but maintained that Dale's death was not linked to money. She claimed Flores was just a friend who helped her when she was in trouble, but offered no explanation for the large sum of debts or the late-night communications. The investigation team, combining homicide and financial detectives, began to construct a layered timeline. Financial stress escalates. 2008, debts with Flores increase. Late 2008, policy details surface, weeks before January 2009. Night of attack, suspicious digital and call patterns. The motive was becoming clear to law enforcement, but they needed hard links between financial incentive and physical action. That meant returning to forensic evidence from the home, fingerprints on the hammer, blood spatter analysis, and any trace evidence that might align with planning rather than a spontaneous act of violence. Forensic lab results confirmed that only Dale's blood was on the hammer, but partial fingerprints matching Marissa were on the handle. While not conclusive by itself, she could have handled the hammer at another time. It raised questions when considered alongside her inconsistent accounts. An investigator later noted in a report, "The financial data and digital evidence align too closely to ignore." When money becomes the motive, timelines rarely lie. In homicide cases involving intimate partners, the motivation often lies buried in a trail of financial distress, personal secrets, or a confluence of both. In the investigation into Dale Harrell's death, the Arizona detectives began following the money, not just in the victim's accounts, but more significantly, in the life of his wife, Marissa-Suzanne DeVault. If motive was to be established, it wouldn't be through the emotions she displayed, it would be through the facts she attempted to conceal. After the attack that left Dale comatose, police secured a search warrant for the couple's home in Gilbert, Arizona. The initial walkthrough of the residence revealed a relatively undisturbed master bedroom, no overturned furniture, no defensive injuries reported on Dale's body at first glance. That discrepancy stood out. If Marissa's version was to be believed, that a masked intruder had broken in and assaulted her husband with a hammer, then where was the chaos such an act should have left behind? Investigators documented the scene, then turned their focus to electronics and financial documents. Dale's computer, retrieved from the living room, was sent for forensic analysis. His cell phone records were subpoenaed. The same applied to Marissa's digital footprint. What emerged from the data would reshape the case entirely. While the victim lay in a medically induced coma, detectives discovered that Marissa had accumulated significant credit card debt under multiple accounts. Credit reports and banking statements revealed that over the span of 3 years leading up to the attack, she had taken out several loans in her name and maxed out credit lines. But that wasn't the most startling detail. Records showed regular transfers and payments toward a private individual, identified through transaction metadata and cell phone contacts as Alan Flores, an older man Marissa had been in a financial relationship with since approximately 2006. Alan was a self-proclaimed benefactor who, in his own words, supported women in need. Surveillance and digital records confirmed that Marissa had visited him frequently, sometimes with overnight stays, while Dale was at work or caring for their children. When questioned, Flores initially refused cooperation, citing privacy. However, when served with a subpoena and reminded of obstruction penalties, he provided more details. According to his interview, he had given Marissa nearly $300,000 over a 3-year period. In return, she had promised to pay him back once she came into her own. Flores also admitted that Marissa had mentioned being afraid of Dale, but text messages and emails between the two painted a different picture, one in which Marissa vented frustrations about Dale's financial control and hinted that it would all be easier if he were gone. While not an overt confession, it was enough to raise flags. Detectives consulted a forensic financial analyst to reconstruct the flow of money. A timeline was established. Between 2006 and 2008, Marissa's dependence on Alan Flores increased. By 2008, she was essentially sustaining her own finances through his support, while Dale remained unaware. But then came the most critical discovery: an active life insurance policy in Dale's name, issued less than a year before the attack, naming Marissa as the sole beneficiary. The payout, $400,000. Investigators questioned the policyholder and issuer. The paperwork had been filled out at Marissa's behest, citing family planning reasons. There was no sign Dale had read the full policy documentation. Financial gain. Secret relationships. Digital communication with suggestive language. And now, a timeline that placed Dale's death squarely at the intersection of growing debt and anticipated payout. The pieces were aligning with one conclusion. The crime was premeditated, not a spontaneous act of desperation. But before the department made any formal accusation, they needed more. Physical evidence to tie the hammer to Marissa, witness testimony to verify behavior changes, and most importantly, Dale's own statement, if he survived. In these types of cases, financial intent is rarely straightforward. But as the evidence mounted, it became clear that the motive wasn't rooted solely in abuse or fear. It was rooted in calculation. From the outside, the Harrell home in Chandler, Arizona, looked untouched. A cookie-cutter suburban house with no signs of forced entry or violence. But behind that facade was a scene investigators now viewed with a different lens. By February 2009, Dale Harrell was dead, and the claim of a mysterious intruder had disintegrated under the weight of forensic facts. With the autopsy confirming Dale's death was caused by blunt force trauma to the head, Marissa-Suzanne DeVault's narrative was officially declared a lie. The initial trauma report had already described the injuries as inconsistent with a defensive altercation. But with Dale's death, that discrepancy now escalated from suspicion to evidence. Law enforcement reopened every element of the crime scene, this time without the distraction of a fictitious attacker. There had never been signs of a break-in. No damaged windows, no tampered locks, no foreign DNA. What investigators did find, weeks after the attack, was the murder weapon, a claw hammer, discovered inside a storage bin in the garage. The handle had been wiped, but blood residue matching Dale's DNA remained in the claw end. Microscopic traces embedded in places that weren't easily cleaned. The hammer had been hidden, not discarded in fear as Marissa originally claimed. Surveillance of Marissa's phone records revealed another critical element. In the days before the attack, she had exchanged over 40 calls and messages with Alan Flores, a former lover who had been sending her substantial sums of money. Flores cooperated with law enforcement and testified that Marissa had described Dale as dangerous and controlling. She claimed she feared for her safety, yet investigators found no evidence in Dale's medical or behavioral history to support that claim. His coworkers and friends described him as quiet, patient, and nonviolent. The money trail told a different story. Marissa had received over $300,000 from Flores over several years, some of it through wire transfers, some in person. These funds were allegedly for living expenses, but financial analysts found that Marissa was using the money to pay off credit card debts, cover mortgage payments, and gamble online. Dale, meanwhile, was unaware of the extent of the financial activity. He believed they were budgeting tightly, unaware of the parallel financial life Marissa had constructed. More damning, investigators uncovered that Marissa had increased Dale's life insurance coverage just 3 months before the attack. In early November 2008, she called the insurance company, requesting to confirm beneficiary details and ask about payout timelines in the event of death by head trauma. The call was logged, recorded, and later used as evidence. When confronted with this during her second interview, Marissa could not provide a logical explanation. Then came the internet history. Forensic analysis of Marissa's laptop, initially overlooked, revealed searches dating back to December 2008. Terms included how to kill in your sleep, how long does insurance take to pay after death, and how to stage a break-in. The device had been wiped after January 14th, but recovery software retrieved key cache data. That data was turned over to the Maricopa County Prosecutor's Office. At this point, the narrative had changed entirely. This wasn't a moment of panic or reaction. This was strategic, structured, intentional. Detectives also returned to medical records. Marissa had claimed she suffered a head injury during the altercation with Dale. A physician at the emergency room noted minor bruising, but no significant trauma consistent with a hammer strike, as she claimed. Her story now appeared even more staged, an attempt to create a self-defense narrative before any suspicion turned her way. The final blow to her credibility came when a former friend, subpoenaed in March 2009, testified that Marissa had once mentioned how some people collect insurance money after their husbands die, and that sometimes women do what they have to. The statement had seemed like an offhand remark at the time. In retrospect, it was chilling. On March 20, 2009, Marissa-Suzanne DeVault was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors would argue that Dale's murder was financially motivated and premeditated. The defense, however, would raise another angle entirely, one that hadn't yet been introduced to the public. And while the evidence was stacking against Marissa, the trial ahead would reveal just how far a person could go to manipulate sympathy even after committing murder. By April 2009, prosecutors in Maricopa County had compiled a comprehensive case file against Marissa-Suzanne DeVault. Forensic data, financial records, digital search history, and the hidden murder weapon all pointed toward premeditated homicide. But when the defense submitted its preliminary motions, it was clear they intended to pivot the trial toward a new controversial direction. They claimed it wasn't murder. It was survival. According to the defense, Marissa had endured years of domestic abuse at the hands of Dale Harrell. Her legal team, appointed by the state due to her financial situation, argued that the fatal hammer attack was the result of accumulated trauma. They introduced the concept of battered woman syndrome early on, attempting to reframe the crime not as calculated, but reactive. From an investigative standpoint, this narrative didn't hold. Detectives had found no prior police reports, no emergency room records indicating physical injury consistent with long-term domestic violence, and no documented witness statements aligning with claims of abuse. Dale Harrell had no documented criminal history or prior domestic disturbances. No neighbors ever reported screaming or fighting. No photos, journal entries, or correspondence suggested escalating violence behind closed doors. Prosecutors anticipated this maneuver. They built a counter-narrative supported by hard evidence: the secret life insurance policy increase, the digital search terms, the staged 911 call, and the methodical concealment of the weapon. They also subpoenaed multiple witnesses from Dale's workplace and social circle. These individuals testified that he was patient, responsible, and expressed frequent concern about Marissa's spending. Not one could recall him showing signs of controlling or violent behavior. The prosecution's position was simple. If Marissa was in danger, why had she not left? Why fabricate a story about an intruder? Why clean and hide the weapon? Trial proceedings began in early 2014 after years of pretrial motions, psychiatric evaluations, and evidentiary hearings. Though the attack occurred in 2009, Marissa had been held in custody without bond during the entire interim. From the outset, the courtroom was heavily scrutinized. Legal analysts predicted that the central battle would not be about whether Marissa killed Dale. She had admitted to that. The question was why. Was it self-defense rooted in fear or murder rooted in financial gain? To support their argument, the defense brought in expert witnesses in clinical psychology. One psychologist testified that Marissa exhibited symptoms consistent with prolonged psychological trauma, including hypervigilance, dissociation, and patterns of submissive behavior. Another attempted to correlate her mental state during the attack to a form of temporary dissociation, but under cross-examination, the prosecution exposed inconsistencies. The experts had largely relied on Marissa's self-reporting, conducted after her arrest. There was no independent confirmation of her accounts. Furthermore, Marissa had failed to mention any history of abuse in her initial police interview. Her story evolved only after the hammer was recovered and the life insurance angle became public. In a key moment of testimony, one of Dale's former colleagues was called to the stand. He recounted a conversation weeks before the attack where Dale confided that their marriage was strained, but he was staying for the sake of their children. He was, the witness said, exhausted from arguing about money. No mention of violence, no fear, just resignation. Throughout the trial, Marissa showed little emotion. She wore conservative clothing, spoke softly, and avoided eye contact with the jury. Her defense counsel emphasized this as evidence of trauma. Prosecutors interpreted it differently, a calculated persona, curated to gain sympathy. The jury heard from Alan Flores as well, the man who had wired Marissa over $300,000. He stated under oath that Marissa often expressed her desire to leave Dale but never mentioned fear for her life. According to him, she spoke more about stress, about wanting independence, and about Dale holding her back financially. By the third week of the trial, a pattern had emerged. For every claim of abuse made by the defense, there was a lack of supporting physical evidence. For every instance of alleged trauma, there was contradictory behavior, financial scheming, calculated searches, and deliberate lies. Still, the defense pressed the emotional narrative, hoping the jury would weigh trauma over intent. Marissa-Suzanne DeVault sat motionless in the defendant's chair as the Maricopa County Superior Court prepared for the final act of a years-long judicial reckoning. The courtroom was silent except for the shuffle of papers and the steady breath of the bailiff. More than 5 years had passed since the early morning of January 14, 2009, when Dale Harrell was bludgeoned in his bed with a claw hammer. The moment had now arrived for the system to decide what justice should look like. On April 22, 2014, after deliberating for nearly 2 full days, the jury announced that they would not seek the death penalty. Instead, they recommended life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision was not made lightly. Jurors had spent months hearing about the nature of the crime, DeVault's personal history, and the financial motivations embedded in her actions. From the outset of the penalty phase, prosecutors pressed the narrative that this was no crime of passion. Dale Harrell had been unconscious from the first strike. He never woke up. There was no struggle, no chaos, only the quiet premeditation of someone who had searched online for fatal head injuries in the weeks prior. The blows, 7 in total, were not frenzied. They were deliberate, focused. The state emphasized the $700,000 in life insurance policies that stood to benefit DeVault and the mounting financial dependence she had on Alan Flores, the man who bankrolled her and later testified against her. The attack wasn't just personal, it was profitable. That mattered to the jury. Still, the defense countered with Marissa's long history of reported abuse, both emotional and physical. They presented witness testimony, journals, and evaluations by psychologists who diagnosed her with PTSD. The core argument, she had snapped under the pressure of a controlling and violent marriage, but the forensic evidence undercut that claim. The wounds Dale sustained didn't indicate a struggle. The cleanup afterward, the staged phone call to 911, and the conflicting stories Marissa told detectives eroded the plausibility of a spontaneous act. When sentencing was read, DeVault showed no visible emotion. She stood, nodded to the court, and was escorted out. No final statement, no apology to Dale's family. The silence said as much as any words could. The presiding judge addressed the court with measured tone. This case is a grim reminder that the pursuit of control, money, or freedom does not justify murder. The sentence imposed reflects the calculated nature of the act and the manipulation that followed. Dale Harrell's relatives, some of whom had attended nearly every hearing, did not speak publicly after the verdict, but court records show that a statement submitted by his sister described him as a good man who was never given a fair chance to defend himself, not in life and not in the narrative that followed his death. Outside the courtroom, reactions were mixed. Some advocates for domestic violence survivors felt conflicted, wondering whether Marissa's past trauma, while not justifying the killing, had gone undervalued. Others pointed out that if she had truly feared for her life, she could have left. But she didn't. She stayed. And ultimately, she lied to police, to friends, to the man whose money she depended on, and she orchestrated a scene designed to deflect blame. By 2025, over a decade since her conviction, Marissa DeVault remains incarcerated at the Arizona Department of Corrections under a sentence of life without parole. No appeals have succeeded in reducing her term. No public effort for clemency has emerged. Her case has faded from headlines. But it occasionally resurfaces in legal studies as a cautionary example of how trauma can be weaponized in court and how motive, when layered with deception, can unravel even the most sympathetic narrative. In the end, the facts stood firm. Dale Harrell, 34, died not because he was a threat in that moment, but because he was an obstacle. The weapon, a claw hammer, was wielded not in panic, but in purpose. And while justice is rarely perfect, this case illustrated the value of patience, scrutiny, and physical evidence over emotion or theatrics. The digital searches, the insurance records, the autopsy, they spoke a truth that outlasted the contradictions. In the end, this story isn't just about a crime. It's about the quiet choices we make that shape our lives, even when no one is watching. If there's one thing I've learned from telling this case, it's this. Pain doesn't justify violence, and silence doesn't erase the truth. We all carry scars, but what we do with them defines who we are. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think justice should look like when trauma and accountability collide? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched something in you, let me know where you're watching from. If you found this video meaningful, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. Your voice, your presence, and your perspective matter here.